All right. Hello, class. I'm really excited for today's guest speaker. We have Chad No. You already have his background information from Titanium. So we'll go ahead and get started. I have prepared some questions, and then he's going to answer some of the questions that you posted. So to get started, welcome, Chad.
Hi, Erin. Hello, HCOP, AHA students. I'm really excited to present to you all today and answer your questions around my experience and my trajectory in public health.
Yay. So to get started with, can you share a little bit about your background? So your profession, where you're currently at and training, as well as some of the identities of that you identify with.
Perfect. Will do. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Chad Ngo. My pronouns are he and him. I'm currently an LGBTQ youth advocate here in San Francisco at this organization called LYRIC. LYRIC stands for Lavender Youth Recreation and Information Center. We're actually the largest LGBTQ youth serving organization center in the country, specifically targeting like queer youth and allies. I am Vietnamese American, first generation to go off to college, and first gen to pursue my master's degree as well. I'm currently finishing up my MPH, so my master's in public health at Cal State Fullerton remotely. So I was supposed to finish last year. Some circumstances kind of like came about, and I ended up in San Francisco. But I'll talk about my project that I worked with in partnership with my current agency and Cal State Fullerton, and how I'm graduating 300 plus miles away. And then identities, like I said, I'm first gen in my family to go off to college. I'm actually also openly gay. And so it's really nice to be working at a queer organization. And in terms of my background, I grew up in San Jose, California. So for everyone from the Bay Area, what's up? And I kind of migrated down to Southern California. I got a bachelor's of arts in public health policy at UCI. And there I did a lot of HIV education work, as well as sexual assault and domestic violence education work as well. And then directly after finishing UCI, I applied for Cal State Fullerton's MPH program. I kind of wanted to keep it local in SoCal instead of like kind of moving so far away. And then I moved to Fullerton, and it's taken me 3 years now to get my degree. So I'm really excited to be done, and at the same time, very grateful for these like past 8 years of work experience in this field.
Awesome. Thank you. So I know you shared just a little bit about your individual journey, but could
Mhm.
you elaborate, like, what do you do, and why?
Okay, awesome. So I, as a public health professional, I've always kind of geeked out when people would ask me like, "Well, why did you choose public health?" I always described it as like a huge umbrella with so many different subtopics that fall underneath. I mean, we even break down public, including everyone, right? And then health, anything that relates to your health impacts your health. So I've always geeked out about that because it's allowed me to kind of specialize and focus in areas that I've been very passionate about. I would say that working as a LGBTQ youth advocate is like really, really, really awesome and really kind of fulfilling for me in a sense because I've been able to give back to my community. So I would definitely classify that the overarching slice of public health that I kind of encompass and navigate is kind of LGBTQ health issues, which is a population that is very unique in its own, made up of very, very diverse members, and definitely a place where I fit in as an openly gay man of color within this little slice as well. And it kind of informs the way I provide my services. Erin, did you want me to talk more about what I do at work currently, or that was good enough?
That's good for now. We can get
Okay.
into your
Yeah.
career a little bit more. So with regards to graduate school, and you kind of touched on this a
Mm.
little bit, what was one of the most important things that you learned during this
Ooh,
whole process?
good question. I think the overarching thing I've learned is to essentially just let things be. Try your best, and then just let things be. Right. Overarching thing, and I'll get more to little specific pieces like unique to grad school. But I think like the overarching thing that I've taken away from these last 3 years is just you know, we oftentimes kind of prescribe ourselves this like map of like what perfection is. And during my experience, I was very, very like set on being like the perfect grad student, getting like perfect grades, doing X, Y, and Z. But when I really have time now to look back in retrospect, what does that even mean? Right. So I would definitely say just try your best. You know, if there's an interest area you want to go for, try it out. If there's a professor you want to talk to them. If there's a research assistant, graduate assistant gig that comes up, give it a shot, send in a resume, right? And don't be afraid to ask for help. I think that's another big piece as well. And this extends even far back to the whole graduate application process. Try your best. There's not going to be a single perfect application. Obviously, like for your statements and your resume, you want to get like your grammar and that kind of like logistical stuff perfect as much as you can. But and when it comes to like painting your story, you want to try your best. But there's going to be no way to really capture it because your lived experience is so complex, beautiful, and nuanced. So I think overarching, that's kind of like what I've learned. Just try your best and let things be. In terms of what I've learned, specifics of grad school, I would say get connected with professors, faculty, get connected with other students. And they necessarily don't even have to be at your home institution. Go to conferences or other local events, or if you have the opportunity to do like national events, and network with a lot of people and get plugged in that way. Now that I've kind of had this like pseudo year away from grad school, even though I'm finishing up grad school, I've found that the relationships that I've built, like at American Public Health Association, which I presented at back in fall 2016, or through like conferences I've attended while I was in SoCal, like they've kind of extended far beyond like geographically, and I've been able to keep in contact with a lot of like public health people in that way. So just like get plugged in.
That's awesome. Yeah. For those of you who haven't met Chad before, he's definitely great at networking with folks, very well connected. And when he was working for the Allied Health Academy, he was very instrumental in getting speakers to come out and just connecting students with different opportunities. So.
Yeah, and I would definitely say like there is like this fear of like reaching out, especially if you're first generation, not only for asking for help, but like maybe meeting people. And it's something that like the best advice I would give is like that's gonna like that fear is gonna become less and less as you try it more. You know, you're gonna introduce yourself. You have nothing to lose, right? Like most of the time, people are kind of afraid if like of rejection. You know, if someone's gonna be able to talk to you, or if you have enough credentials, like that's all bullshit. Like just introduce yourself. Like, and if you're interested in someone's research, just be genuine about it. Most people can read it. And if unfortunately someone, you know, comes off a negative way that you reached out to, or maybe was kind of disappointing, that's them, not you. So you got to learn how to separate that. Don't take it personally. And for every single person that maybe doesn't get back to you or doesn't give you that kind of positive response, there'll be so many more people who'll be willing to talk about what they do, meet up with you for coffee, you know, do an informational interview. I hope you watch the videos. And
they actually have to do that in this class. So
perfect. So you'll be watching them soon.
Yeah.
If not already.
So I guess kind of related to that, what was the biggest misconception that you had about grad school? Because I know perhaps as first generation college students, or you know, even undergrads who don't really have much exposure to grad school, maybe the networking is like something that that they don't really think about. But now that you're pretty much done with that process, like what do you think was one of the myths that was dispelled, or like some some aspect of grad school that you thought like, oh, well, that didn't turn out how I had intended, or you didn't even think about it?
Yeah. Okay, y'all, I'm gonna serve it up to you really real right now. One of the hugest myths that I've been able to kind of reflect on and kind of realize is like, one, higher institution isn't made for people of color. Historically, higher institution has excluded people of color, and anytime that there's been an inclusion of people of color in that conversation in the domain, it's been exploitation. So, you know, you have to keep that in mind. And I definitely didn't reflect on those kind of aspects or that reality until far after. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, I entered this space wanting to be the perfect graduate student. right? And as a result, feeling imposter syndrome, which is a real thing, right? And those are symptoms of a larger issue at play. Like at the institution of education, it's made by white folk for white folk, right? This is why AHA exists. So we can get more diversification of POC into these different professions. But it's also very oppressive. And I think that people don't talk about that, right? Like being expected to take all these classes and excel, being, you know, being kind of like made to feel like, you know, you're like one of the last, you're not represented in your classes. Like you're sitting there and you're like, oh my gosh, there's not a lot of people. Granted, as an Asian American, a lot of my experience in higher education has been kind of affirming in that way, where I've seen a lot of Asian American peers around, but oftentimes I've always been the one gay person in the room, the one openly out gay person in the room. So kind of feeling oppressed in that way. And I definitely think you need to keep those things in mind. You need to keep in mind that you existing and being in this space is radical and enough in itself. And that this is not to downplay any challenges you're gonna have. You're gonna have a lot of challenges. And I think it's really great to recognize when you are being challenged and you're feeling down, to reach out for help, in whatever the way that looks like to you. Some people like to seek like therapy services, which is really great. Some people seek out like community, which is really great. Some people do a mix of different things. So you need to find out what works for you. And I think that was one of the biggest myths, was going into it being like, okay, I'm gonna really excel, maybe this perfect grad student, but in the end realizing like I couldn't even define what that meant for myself. It led me to like burn out, doubt myself, took a huge toll on like my mental, social, physical health, and all of that. So definitely recognizing that, as well as being able to reach out when you need help.
So not to scare folks off, but definitely thank you, Chad, for being real about that. I think that is something that I felt as well when I was going through my master's in public health, and even some of the things that I got involved in, or the class assignments that I ended up doing, was related to how does being in grad school influence students' health, right? And sometimes you think like, oh, well, these are all health programs. Shouldn't they practice what they preach?
Yeah.
But, you know, a lot of these structural oppressions are like deeply embedded into these institutions. So there are different things that students can do, faculty, staff, that are trying to improve the situation for underrepresented folks in.
And I definitely, thanks Aaron for that. I definitely I don't want to scare y'all. I think y'all should all pursue and go off to grad school, but I at the same time think it would be very irresponsible of me to not share that with you. And I think that painting grad school as this like very like rose colored lens, and painting it as this like very happy place, which it can be for a lot of people, would be very irresponsible, right? Because you're going to be really stressed. And when you enter grad school, a lot of it's left on you. While as an undergrad, you know, maybe you didn't feel like you had to, you know, you pick your classes and you go to classes. Grad school, a lot of the opportunities that present themselves, you have to go for. Like no one's going to hand it to you. No one's going to remind you. But on the flip side, having gone through this experience and being so close to the end now, like I would, you know, I don't regret anything about it. I think it was one of the most life-changing, enlightening like experiences that I've ever been through. It really reaffirmed my resilience, really reaffirmed my passion for this field, and really reaffirmed like why we need public health, especially in this political moment. So I don't want y'all to just run the other way. I want you to kind of know what you're getting into and run full force. And also know that there are going to be people there to support you who, you know, are also people of color, who are also been through similar experiences. You'd be surprised, like talk to professors of color and get their stories. Oftentimes you'll kind of hear the same tidbits of advice from someone like with their PhD already, who is still navigating that. So it also kind of shines a lens on the system as a whole, but us being there and kind of thriving in the system is a good step forward in terms of like not only populating it, but changing it.
Thanks for adding some of the benefits of going through the process and the
Mm-hmm.
support systems that are available. Definitely, I I think it's so helpful to be honest about the challenges so that students know how to, well, first of all, that they aren't alone when they experience it, but
Mm-hmm.
also that they're equipped a little bit better to navigate those spaces. Um,
Yeah.
kind of in a related question, so how did going to grad school prepare you for what you are currently doing? And then could you also talk about what you are currently doing in your job?
Cool. Yeah. I definitely think grad school helped me grow up a lot.
Hmm.
Definitely, for sure. I think one of the biggest pieces it allowed me to kind of have more of a critical understanding of the world and public health's position into it. I don't have all the answers to everything. You're not going to find all the answers to everything in grad school just because the world is so complex and so large and there's so many issues. But I will say that whatever area you decide to kind of specialize in or focus in, you'll definitely see the world differently through that lens. I mean, for me, that is. I see everything through a public health lens. Currently at my agency, I'm a youth advocate, which is kind of like the equivalent of a case manager. So for all you social work folk, I do a lot of referrals. So Lyric, we are the longest standing youth serving organization here in San Francisco. We've been around since 1988. And we provide like a range of different types of services. It could be like anything like health related, right? So if someone wants to get tested or get on pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is PrEP, a daily once a day pill, daily pill you take once a day that can prevent HIV. We can help them with that. We also help in the legal realm. So let's say someone wants to change their name and gender on their ID documents. We can go to the San Francisco courts and do that with them. We can also help them with housing. So if a young person is at risk of losing, their housing, or they're in an unsafe housing situation, we can definitely get them into either the shelters and ideally secure more kind of permanent, sustainable housing with the city. We also do a lot of work, just a lot of advocacy work, anything that a young person needs. And when I say young person, we serve anyone 24 years old and younger. So in the social service health field, typically a youth is defined from ages 13 to 24. So it's kind of like a very important stage. It's also known as adolescence, right? So it's like a very important stage where you're changing and growing. Maybe your decision making isn't the best because your brain hasn't developed in that way. So there's a lot of like risk there, right? Health risk, physical risk, like all these type of risks there. And oftentimes it can be hard to navigate, especially with like all these different messages that are thrown at you in the media or depending on where you grow up. But it's definitely, going to grad school has definitely helped me grow up in a sense where it's allowed me to kind of critically look at systems at play, how they impact the clients we service here, and how we as like individual agents of change, we're not going to be able to change the system overnight, but we can at least make particular participants' day better, right? By helping them go to the courthouse and change their name and gender, and advocating for them so that they can kind of be in the best places possible to like live their full life.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical takeaway that sometimes when we face some of these issues, like a few weeks ago, the students shared what they feel are the biggest issues, the biggest health
Mm-hmm.
issues right now. And a lot of times it can feel daunting, like dealing with
Yeah.
mental health, obesity, all these other things. But it is reassuring that there are different people working on different levels to address these issues. So, what you do on a daily basis, working one-on-one with individuals, that little by little leads to change. So,
Yeah, and then you're definitely going to find your fit, right? Like oftentimes, I would say for a lot of people in public health, you kind of start off working with individuals, but there's also, or you may not, right? But there's a lot of different realms you can go into. Right? There's like data is really important, administration is really important, policy is really important. The kind of advocacy front is really important. Being out there mobilizing people is really important. And you're going to kind of come to understand, and the whole realm of education and research is very important. You're going to come to understand that this is all an ecosystem and everyone intersects. So you're going to have to kind of work with other people on other fronts. And you also have the opportunity to kind of like jump ship and go into different areas, right? that you may be interested in. Especially, I would say, like, having gone to grad school and kind of having the social capital that comes with saying, like, I'm a graduate candidate, or I have my master's, I'm about to finish my MPH. It gives you that leverage to apply to or get your foot in to these different areas, whereas a bachelor's, you might feel more limited in what you can do. So whether or not you're doing an MPH, MSW, DPT, you are going to have a lot of opportunity to kind of like try out all these different areas.
So could you briefly share what has been the best part of working where you're working right now?
Yeah, it's always been a gay boy dream of mine to move to San Francisco. I think with a lot of people as well. And Erin was there on the day when I made the decision, because I had like two different job opportunities present themselves after like months of applying. I used to work for HA as a graduate assistant. I believe Emily's kind of my position right now. So if you chat with Emily, I used to be the Emily. And so I would say the best piece is learning how social services and public health functions in a city like San Francisco. San Francisco is extremely progressive and on the forefront of a lot of like health, kind of health frontiers on the public health frontier. And going from like Orange County, which was a little bit way more conservative, and LA County, which was kind of rife with its own issues, to a place like San Francisco has been really amazing to see the type of policies they pass. For example, if you're a high school student in one of the San Francisco Unified School Districts, like high schools, you can literally go to the health worker on site and tell them, I need to get tested. And they will anonymously refer you to a youth clinic, and you can go during school hours, and it's not deducted from your class or anything like that, and your parent won't find out. And they will send you to get picked. They'll either have someone pick you up and take you, or send you over there. So for you to get tested, to get on birth control, for anything, like, that's amazing, right? So to be in this kind of sphere where something like that's happening, it's awesome. And this is not to say that San Francisco doesn't have, its cons. There are a lot of issues going on. That, if you're interested in learning more, you can reach out to me, and I'm more than willing to chat about kind of like the different perspectives going on here. But in terms of public health, it's very, very, very progressive compared to other counties and other places in this country. So that's been my favorite part, being in this type of sphere, meeting people who are like very radical in their approach to health, and not only being radical in their perspective, but having a lot of their kind of like policies and initiatives backed by like evidence-based practice, which is really important.
Wow.
It's really cool.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that's a piece that we don't think about, right? Like, where are we working, right? Not just what kind of setting, whether it's clinical in a school or out in the community, but also like, what is the political atmosphere, right? Who are the people that you're serving? Like, all of these other things are things to consider. For our students who are thinking like, oh, well, I want to be a social worker, or I want to be an occupational therapist, right? Like, where do you want to practice? Like, how does the context around the neighborhood influence what you're going to be able to do or what you're not going to be able to do?
The one thing I will caveat, and on top, and can I piggyback on like what Erin kind of shared, it's really great, for me being in San Francisco as someone who's previously done HIV related work, because this historically was the epicenter of the AIDS, one of the epicenters of the AIDS crisis. But another thing that I've realized being here is that we can't have every public health, PT person, social worker come to San Francisco, right? Because it's more progressive. Because when you really think about it, the communities that need it the most often are kind of like the rural communities, the small towns, right? That are kind of being devastated by like economic collapse and budget cuts and all of that. So on a dual flip side, me being here has also made me realize that there is a huge need elsewhere as well, because it can become very oversaturated. So really think about that as well. Like, if you want to get the big city experience, go for it. Live it, try it out. It's also going to kind of like turn your eye to realize like, oh, wow, like, I'm far, like, there's so many of me right now, other individuals doing what I do here, which is great. But if there's a lot of individuals doing what I do here, it makes you question like, in other places, do they have this type of ratio, or is it lacking? So kind of opens your eyes to that as well. So I think tying it back to HA and the goal of you getting your kind of not only getting your undergrad, but going into grad school and returning to your community and giving back in that way is very, very vital and very important. If that's something you want to do, right? Like if that's something you want to do long term or whatever, you decide.
Yeah, definitely. All of the careers that we focus on in the Allied Health Academy are in demand in Orange County, so that's good.
Really good.
So I think it's important to think about what communities do you belong to, and how can you best serve those communities. And sometimes those communities are geographic, sometimes they're culturally based, sometimes they're just, other kinds of communities. So yeah, important to keep all that into context. So I do want to have some time to get to students' questions. So first of all, thank you, students, for submitting your questions. This is the first time we've had a guest speaker for this class. So trying out this online way of soliciting questions so that you can still have some interaction even though we're not in a classroom together. Chad received a list of the questions that were sent over by Friday morning, and he has selected a few that he's gonna answer. So.
Perfect. First off, I want to say that these lists of questions I received were really robust, and y'all asked a lot of really awesome things. Unfortunately, I won't be able to go through all of them, but I've kind of selected the ones that kind of cover all the themes that arose. So the first question I'll answer is from Courtney C. And I'm just going to summarize up the question, right, for time's sake. Basically, Courtney asked about my work with the prep program, lyrics prep program, designing the brochure, and asked if this kind of like health education like intervention has kind of spread far beyond just the LGBTQ community into kind of general pop, and kind of essentially what are my thoughts on that. So I'll first start off by saying that as a part of my graduation requirement, I was able to strike a deal with Cal State Fullerton and my current agency to work on the lyric prep program, which launched last fall, so fall 2017. PrEP, as many of you don't know, is pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's manufactured by the pharmaceutical company Gilead. It's also known as Truvada. You take it once a day. Most people kind of liken it to birth control in that sense. You take it once a day, and if you take it as prescribed once a day, after a certain time frame, once you were initially prescribed, your body accumulates a lot of medication in it that can block HIV. So if you were potentially exposed to HIV, your chances of contracting it are like lower, like extremely, extremely slim. And if you kind of like follow it and do regular checkups as well, which is kind of mandated for being on the medication, your chances are super, super slim. And if you pair it with like safer sex techniques like condoms and all of that. So I was able to develop a brochure and a flyer. This is my brochure. It says, "Hey youth, take a pill a day, prevent HIV your way." And then this is actually what Truvada looks like. It's a blue pill. On the other side, it says Truvada. On one side, it says 701. So we kind of, when we designed this, we wanted to market it in a way that kind of destigmatized medication in this sense, because a lot of people from a lot of different communities, don't have historically the best experience with medication and may be wary of this. So we wanted to just expose our youth to what the pill looks like. It's a 6-fold panel. And the way that it was designed was very youth-friendly. So you're not going to be able to see all the details. I'll send a PDF scan to Erin, so Erin can circulate it around as well. You can read up on the details and actually learn what PrEP is. But it's basically a PrEP 101. There's a lot of Q&A questions that are asked, and these were collected by our peer navigators who work directly with the youth we're servicing. And so they collected like the most commonly asked questions. We had our youth. I took control of the whole development process, but we included a handful of our youth participants in designing this as well. Colors, font, whether or not the information provided was too clinical versus being youth friendly. So kind of just like locations of like the PrEP clinic we work with. and kind of like a little mini map on the side as well. And it is in partnership with the San Francisco Department of Public Health and the SF-AIDS Foundation. Most people who go through a master's program will have to complete some type of culminating experience. It could be a thesis for those who want to continue on into a PhD. That's a traditional route. A lot of the time nowadays, like people don't have to do a thesis to go on to pursue a doctorate, but that's kind of been traditionally like what people do if they want to go that route. You can do a research project where you analyze data. I'll touch upon my original research project before I shift it to this in the next few questions. Or you can kind of design like a brochure or something like, I guess, tangible for an agency, which is what I did. And the cool thing with this is after designing this and getting it approved by not only Lyric, but the Department of Public Health, it's throughout the city. So my final project is literally at other agencies sitting through the city where youth can see. So that's a really good feeling. In terms of the question piece about PrEP and youth, there's actually not a lot of data on PrEP and youth overall. Most of the research has been focused on the adult population. One main reason being is that there's a lot of ethical legal protections for individuals 18 and under when it comes to research. Such as like the age in which you are targeting, right? The age of the population, whether or not you get parental guardian consent, and even like something like the dosing, right? So even if I got like a PrEP research program approved, at what age I'm administering the medication can have some effects on development. We don't know what those effects are. So PrEP is relatively new. The FDA approved it back in 2012. So it's only been out on the market for like 6 years. And so when I took on this project, PrEP has already been tested and shown to be effective, right? As an effective preventative tool. I didn't do anything clinical in that realm. I didn't analyze the efficacy of the medication amongst youth. I just created the social marketing campaign. So kind of like this, and then this little like brochure card that can be handed out. I'll also send a scan of that so you can take a look at it. So what we do know right now is that there were roughly, so, you know, when you're designing materials, right, social marketing materials, it's always backed up by theory, by kind of theory and best practices that I've already done. So in the process of designing this, I looked at it from a harm reduction perspective. And a harm reduction perspective is one that individuals are going to make choices and decisions based on a variety of factors. And those decisions can sometimes have repercussions to their health. So a perfect example is like sex, right? Like teens are going to have sex. The actual data that we have existing of teens having sex has been consistent throughout the last couple of decades. So knowing that, it's not really effective to tell teens don't have sex, because what are teens going to do? They're going to have sex, right? And if they're uninformed and don't have access to, like, let's say condoms or birth control, they're going to be at higher risk of contracting STIs, being at risk of having an unwanted pregnancy, as well as a host of other issues like psychological issues and health issues, mental health issues, and all of that, cultural issues as well. So I took it from a harm reduction perspective where none of our language is judgmental. None of our language within this brochure tells you what to do. It presents them the option like, hey, if you want to get on this, this is another option you can have. And it's very informative in that way. Another lens that I took was one from the trans-theoretical model, or the stages of change, which is kind of a behavioral theory that people are going to go through certain stages of change to a certain outcome, right? And in this outcome, we wanted youth to get on PrEP. So this specifically targets youth who are in the kind of like pre-contemplation, contemplation stage. So they're like thinking about it, they don't know much about it. By kind of finding one of these brochures or meeting one of our peer navigators, they learn more. So that kind of pushes them towards like, oh, like now that I know more, I might want to go to the clinic, right? They want to take action upon it. So that was kind of like the theoretical foundation of the social marketing campaign. And so in that sense, we are targeting a population that really hasn't been looked at, which is with this youth. But we do know the CDC did tell us back in 2015, roughly 8,800 youth were diagnosed with HIV, unfortunately. And of those youth, so 13 to 24, of those youth, 81%, or roughly 7,100, were young men who have sex with men. So, and more specifically, young gay bisexual men who identified as either Black or Latinx were the highest groups contracting HIV. So you also have to look at data when you're designing interventions to see who it goes to. Like I said, there's a huge gap right now on how PrEP is working with these populations. So we're hoping that, being one of the first organizations to kind of launch this program, that we're going to be able to collect data and publish it and give it back to the community, and kind of learn more about like what's working, what doesn't work when it comes to this population, because it's been really successful with adults generally. The one thing I will say about PrEP as an intervention, it's been heavily marketed towards gay men, particularly white gay men. So we cannot have a conversation about PrEP without acknowledging this. And it's unfortunate in the sense where there's other communities that may be left out, such as Black and brown communities who have, huge health disparities when it comes to HIV infection, who are not receiving this intervention in a way that's culturally competent or relatable, or kind of pushing them towards wanting to be on PrEP. In terms of being able to spread this to the population at large, I personally believe that's going to take a little bit more time, because you have to assess risk. And we live in an age right now where funding is getting cut left and right. So you're going to have to be really smart with where you allocate your funding. Do I agree with this model? I don't. I think everyone should have access to PrEP, but you're going to have to look at the numbers and the data that's available. And queer youth, gay and bisexual young men who are having sex with men fall under the umbrella of what would be queer youth. So we're going to kind of funnel our attention that way. And so that was question 1 from Courtney. I know I went on a long ramble, but I think I touched on lot of several questions in there. Erin, did you want to add anything before I move on to the second question real quick?
Just very briefly, thank you for getting into more specifics about what it is that you're doing and all of the socio-political considerations. And I think it's a great example of how you can take what you're learning about in the classroom and actually apply it so that it creates change. Yeah. That's wonderful.
Thank you. And the one thing in grad school, you're going to be in an environment where it's kind of it's almost kind of like a little petri dish, right? It's very contained, and you're able to come up with all these ideas and test these ideas and work on a project that kind of promotes this idea. The one thing that is different you're going to have to learn is that once you move on to the real world, you might have this grand idea of how to address a problem, but there are also real constraints on whether that idea gets actually pushed into an intervention. And oftentimes it's not as quick as you want it to happen. Issues like funding, agencies, it's very political, unfortunately. It's very political. So that's a whole nother conversation, but I want you to be mindful of that in the real world, there are these other constraints that come into play. But at the same time, on the flip side, if you're in an environment that's very supportive of what you're doing, right, and pushing for it, and you have the resources, you can watch something like this, literally manifest and just spread, and have youth walk around with your brochure, or see people actually picking it up and reading it, and seeing enrollment in your program go up. So yeah, it just really, really is dependent. So the next, transitioning to the next piece, I had a lot of questions around what my original research project was and how I kind of want to investigate LGBTQ health and the criminal legal system for a potential PhD. So this one question is by Dennis H. It's basically Dennis asked, as of so far, what kinds of impact does the criminal legal system have on LGBTQ health?
That's a big one.
That's a really good question. I want to start off first that I have been very intentional as of recently to use the criminal legal system instead of the criminal justice system when I talk about it. There's powers in words. The criminal justice system implies that there is some type of justice being administered. That's up to you to question what that justice is, what does it look like, and who's administering it to what communities. I prefer to use the criminal legal system because it encompasses a large ecosystem of different agencies and actors within kind of a space where people may be criminalized, and what happens to them thereafter, right, under the American legal system. So originally, when I was working on my master's research project last year, I was working with an agency in downtown LA. It's a nonprofit that worked directly in the LA County jails, working with LGBTQ folk who are incarcerated, and how they were kind of potentially responding to HIV Hep C interventions in the jails. I'll forward my research poster over as well. So if you all want to take a more in-depth look at that, you can look into it. I'm just going to give you a quick summary now for time's sake. And so I was working with that agency, and there were a lot of issues that kind of came up that were external from my research. And unfortunately, I had to leave that agency and discontinue my work with them. So that just kind of highlights, one thing. Sometimes it's not you. Sometimes there's some changes within the organization that can impact your work. So kind of be prepared for that happening too, right? Things will change. But if that didn't happen, I wouldn't end up in San Francisco where I'm at, we're having done the PrEP brochure. So everything happens for a reason. But the criminal legal system is one huge beast. I would definitely say reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow is a really good read. Watching The 13th, it's a documentary on Netflix, is another good read. A lot of criminal legal work has been focused on racial disparities for a good reason. And one kind of population that I found kind of gets left out of the narrative are queer individuals, so LGBTQ folk, because there are LGBTQ folk who belong to certain races and ethnic backgrounds that are targeted, right? So everything intersects, these identities intersect, they're not separate from one another. And oftentimes what you find is that a lot of LGBTQ folk, particularly the trans population, is heavily targeted and policed. More specifically, trans folk who are Black or brown, oftentimes don't even make it into the criminal legal system because they're killed, just killed by the police. But for those who do get caught up in the criminal legal system, it's often through either sex work or drugs, which kind of makes you critically look at larger systems that kind of make people end up at that outcome, right? Like of sex work. Most of the time, most people engage in sex work because they don't see any other avenue. I actually lead a sex workers advocacy group here at Lyric. So that's a lot of the population that I work with are individuals who don't have the resources to apply for different types of jobs, not because they don't want to, or not because they're not qualified. It's just because they just haven't been given the opportunity. And the fact that even if they're given the opportunity, they maybe face violence and discrimination, prejudice in the workplace for being who they are. So when everything's kind of shuns you out to the margins, what does one turn to, right? Sex work has been the oldest profession in the book, but that's a whole nother conversation. But in terms of like the criminal legal system, that's one specific aspect one can have. The history of policing amongst queer folk goes all the way back. Like fun little fact, the reason why gay pride exists is because the first gay pride was actually a riot because queer folk back at 1969 decided that they didn't want police coming into the bars and arresting them anymore for just socializing and being amongst community. And this kind of takes you back to the Stonewall riots. And so the whole idea of the criminal legal system and LGBTQ folk, they have been intrinsically tied together, unfortunately. But that's, like I said, another conversation. If you're more interested, I am more than open to chat about this. And that's something I kind of want to reserve for my PhD. Still thinking about it. I also want to throw in this piece where don't feel pressured to go a certain way. And a lot of my professors, while I was in grad school, gave me this tip of like, keep working, like once you leave, work a little bit before you go to PhD. And like, now that I'm working, I really appreciate their advice. If you decide to go the whole academic route, do it, right? But I think there's value in getting out there and working with communities and individuals and different populations that can definitely inform and enrich your research later on if you decide to go back to get a doctorate. So that's that question. And then I think the last question was, I found a theme where individuals are asking like, what was my motivation behind entering this field? So I know Jessica G asked essentially, what are some personal experiences that led me to kind of go a solo very long time. But I think if ever so, not more than like, if ever so.
Wait, hold on.